Welcome to Mr. Rodman's Top 12 Highlights, and we begin the year again with Chapter 1 and the Constitutional Democracy. Let's look at what it means to be a constitutional democracy. Government is representing the interests of the people. So we talk about a government that is free, a society that is free and has free will, but also free and fair elections. Government is not centralized in power. It is fragmented in that there are levels of government, national, state, local. There are also departments of government branches, if you will, such as the executive, legislative, and judicial. And in order for anybody to get anything done, you're going to have to work together. You're going to have to build a coalition, and you're going to have to compromise. It's a dirty word in Washington these days, but you are going to have to compromise if you're going to get anything done. Anybody who is successful in getting legislation passed knows that it's going to be a team effort, and you're going to have to give a little to get a little. That's how a constitutional democracy works. Now, this idea of direct versus representative, direct would be everybody votes. That's a pure democracy. We obviously don't have the time for 320 million people to be able to vote on everything at all levels of government in all branches of government. It's just not feasibly possible. So we have a representative democracy where people represent us, and then as a result of that representative democracy, if we don't like what they're doing, we can throw them out. But they represent us, and we elect them to represent us and pass laws over us that consent of the governed, then we have to follow. A couple of things to look at on the state level in terms of types of direct democracy we do have at present, not necessarily all in Maryland, but in different states. Direct primary, we have a closed primary in Maryland, but it is direct in that you can nominate the party officials that you want to run in the general election, in the November election, for your party. So you elect who the party is, who the party representatives are in June of the election year. You will then vote for who you want your candidate from your party to be for governor, for state senator, for state delegate, and so on, and for members of Congress. Initiative is where a petition gets started. This is the idea of signing a petition outside of a grocery store, and that ends up putting it to referendum if there's enough votes. Referendum is placing the issue on the ballot. And if the issue passes on the ballot, which most of them do, it becomes law and has the full force of law unless the state legislature decides to intervene. And then recall is something we don't have here in Maryland, but we have seen California and Wisconsin have recall elections on their governors. In California, they did remove their governor, Gray Davis, back in the 90s during the electricity crisis. And then in Wisconsin, Scott Walker faced a recall vote. He was not removed. So there's a good example of one situation in which a recall was successful and one in which it wasn't. The College Board wants us to know these three models of representative democracy. So really important that we look here at a participatory one. That's where we have broad participation by members of our society, those citizens that are active in the policy making. That's not just voting. That's also letting their voice be heard on particular issues they care about, on things that our elected officials, representatives should pass, things they should fail, things they should kill, things they should support. So that's the participatory aspect. A pluralist democracy is when we have groups that represent us, and they're competing for influence in that policy-making process, such as I mentioned in class, the NRA and AARP. These are groups that are very influential in Washington, and they can help pass a bill or kill a bill. And they represent a number of people, which is why they have so much influence, because in representing a lot of people, they hold a lot of sway on Capitol Hill. And that's the group or the oligarchical democracy mentality here that is known in pluralist. And then we have the elitist democracy. And this is a smaller group of people. You wouldn't think they would have as much power as they do, but they do. So the elitist democracy comes from that idea of the elite theory of influence. The idea behind an elitist democracy is that these people have an inordinate amount of power compared to the person that they are, the people they represent, a much smaller group. But because of their influence and the positions that they hold, and think of it like CEOs of tech companies, or think of it like people who are disproportionately in charge of particular movements or smaller groups that tend to have some sway. They can call shots in terms of other things that are getting done. And so, when the CEO of Apple, Tim Cook, calls up Capitol Hill or the White House, gets an audience, that's part of the elitist democracy, a small group of people with an enormous amount of power that's very different than we see in participatory or a pluralist democracy type of setting. Now, some other forms of government. Remember, autocracy, one person. Think Hitler in terms of who's in charge. Oligarchy, small group of people. Think the Central Committee in China that's in charge. They call the shots. Democracy, again, could be direct or representative. This is, voting by the people, of the people, for the people. A theocracy, more like Iran, which is the idea of a religious-based government that is in play there. Now, we have absolute monarchy, which is kind of the old school British model, think King George, that had all control. Today's British government, though, is more constitutional monarchy, in that the crown is really a figurehead or ceremonial in nature, where it's really the parliament that's in charge. And then totalitarian dictatorship is very similar to the autocracy we talked about before. It can be a small group of people that's in charge, but usually dictator, meaning one, is in charge there, or a small group. So it could be oligarchical or it could be autocratic, but very similar in nature in terms of they're the ones calling the shots, and that's all the shots they call. Now, how is this different than what we see, than what we see in oligarchy, such as in China? They're allowing much more devolution on the local level or the regional levels, where people can elect people. So it's not quite the same type of totalitarian dictatorship we'd be talking about in an oligarchical setting there. A little different. What values do we share in democracy? And this is kind of where we start to see how we go about delivering these things is very different. And that starts to shape us into the parties and the platforms and the ideals in terms of our ideology and how they're shaped. Many people value personal liberty, and we can kind of all rally around the flag on personal liberty. After 9/11, for instance, we all valued freedom. We all valued liberty. We were Americans. We weren't Republicans or Democrats or independents or third parties. We were all about America first, and the idea of helping to take care of what was going on in our country and the attack that we were under. And so it was very much a rally around the flag. Now, in peacetime, that changes, and we look at things like earthquakes and all kinds of natural disasters or war or famine or other types of problems that are going on in the world, and we kind of take a different view. But the idea is in what happens in wartime and in peacetime is often different. But when we look at these issues, individualism, equality of opportunity, popular sovereignty, the voting by the will of the people, we can kind of value that in society in terms of these are values that we hold dear. These are a part of our political culture. Now, how we go about instituting them is where we start to see the parties splinter, where we start to see differences. And that is where it shapes much of our debate that we have today. What do we value in terms of processes? Well, obviously, free and fair elections, very important to popular sovereignty and to a representative democracy. Majority rule, the person with the most votes wins, one more than half. Plurality, the person with the most votes, would not be more than half, would be less than half, but they still have the most votes. That would be the difference there between majority versus plurality. We value free expression. Again, how that's carried out starts to delineate the parties and the individuals in those parties. And then the right to assembly and protest, we look at those in the First Amendment as well. What structures do we value in a democracy? Federalism, the idea of sharing of power between national, state, and local governments. Separate powers, the idea of an executive branch, a legislative branch, a judicial branch that have their own power, but it is separate but equal in terms of the powers that check and balance each other, leading to this check and balance approach, so that no one becomes more powerful, no branch becomes more powerful than the other. Bicameralism, we have two chambers of a legislative body, one in which is checking the other to make sure that the laws that end up going to the White House for the president's signature are not something that are just the whims of the masses or the heated passions of the day, but really something that is decided on by both chambers of Congress. It's passed by both chambers, and as a result, it has simmered down in terms of the concerns that might be the whims of the masses or the heated passions of the people there. And then the Bill of Rights, outlining those first 10 amendments to the Constitution that really look at things like the right to free speech, the right to freedom of religion, and the establishment of that religion, the right to a speedy trial and a trial by a jury of your peers, the right to be free from search and seizure, and the right to remain silent if you have not been told your rights, and you have the right to an attorney. Those types of things in the Bill of Rights. So how we go about them then tends to differentiate us in terms of political persuasion and party. But what do we hold dear? We look at the Bill of Rights and say, who doesn't value the Bill of Rights? But when we get down into the details, that's where ideas and ideologies start to splinter. Now, the natural rights theory is really coming from the philosophers, that this is an idea that was bigger than our government, was bigger than the government that is in place. And the philosophers really hemmed in on this because the idea was that it was given by at that time it was given by God. There was a higher power that was launched here, and the idea behind it was that it wasn't something that government could take away. It was something that government could limit in terms of placing laws that people had to follow, but some of these rights were unalienable in that they couldn't be taken away by any human. In terms of some of the rights that were dear, we look at this today in terms of what Jefferson talked about as in the Declaration of Independence as life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. Right, the idea of life, liberty, and property. These are unalienable. How can someone possibly create laws to take away our liberties, to take away our life, what we've fought to protect and defend and hold to be freedom that is so valuable? But the idea behind this is that you're trying to protect rights in order to maintain order. And what Hobbes was looking at here is this idea of trying to provide some type of a contract that was necessary here because man was let's be honest, Hobbes said we were poor, nasty, brutish. It was a very solitary life, and a very short one at that. So without government, we wouldn't have the capabilities or the ability to really preserve humankind, and this was majorly problematic. So how would you possibly be able to have a better life for your children or your grandchildren when you couldn't trust that the people down the street weren't going to kill you in the middle of the night and take over all your property and move on? And this was why, he said the human nature advocates that there needs to be some type of a government. And this is where Locke comes in to say, well, we've got to create some type of a contract with government so that that we're able to protect those rights, that life, liberty, property that we talked about earlier. So there's a social contract that's created here, and it's created for the purposes of reining men in so that they can then follow the laws of government, and they give up some of those rights in order to maintain and enjoy the order of things that government is there to protect. So it's not just a free-for-all and vigilante society, but one in which people are being punished for violating people's ability to exercise their natural rights. And that really caught on, and the founders Madison and Jefferson talked in their letters back and forth to each other all about this, because it was really the design that they used to draft the Constitution, really around this idea of a social contract. What is government there for? What is a central government there for? It's there to protect us and maintain order, and then get out of the way and let people be people, and let them have their freedoms, their life, their liberty, their property. Montesquieu said, well, if there's a contract to this type of thing, and you're going to give government power, you got to make sure you keep that power from becoming too powerful. Keep that government from becoming too powerful. So maybe we should put this idea of a check and balance, or separating the powers, into play. And this is kind of the idea that Madison then took from Montesquieu to really look at the Constitution and say, hey, why don't we have three separate branches, legislative, executive, and judicial, that have separate powers, make the laws, enforce the laws, interpret the laws, but they each have their own kind of area of control and power, but they're able to check each other. And that check and balance is so important here to keep government from becoming too powerful and then overtaking the life, liberty, and property that humans hold dear. And so that's where we came up in Madison's ideas, came up with the idea of the legislative, executive, and judicial. And in his writings with Jefferson, we see that played out in more detail. And then we come to Rousseau, who's talking about this idea of the social contract and the importance of making sure that government is limited while we try and keep unlimited the powers and the importance of the rights we give to humans, to the voters, and allow them those individual and unlimited rights to everything else. So government isn't tempted to take over and take control. This would be more dangerous. But what you lose through the social contract, Rousseau said, is really the idea that everything that is tempting you here is out of your control. But what he gains as a result is an idea of that life, liberty, and property, and that the society that he lives in maintains order, and humankind then can maintain that order to the point that they can enjoy the life, liberty, and property that they have remaining. So government is limited in nature. It is separated according to what we saw in Montesquieu. It is checked and balanced in what we've seen here. But the idea is that because of that order and because of some of the things we're giving up through the social contract, we're gaining in that we have the life, liberty, and property that we so wanted in the first place. And that's really critical. Now, what brought on the ideas of the Articles of Confederation not being able to withstand this? This is Shays Rebellion. If you can't put down a rebellion in states where you essentially have no central government in the colonies, and you have no control over a central army or some type of force, how are you ever going to put down a rebellion? How are you ever going to put down a much bigger rebellion if there's a problem down the road? Hint, hint. Slavery was definitely in the back of the minds of some of these individuals. And the founders and framers saw this and said, well, if we don't have a central government in place, how will this country ever survive intact? How will it not just become 13 separate states that become their own nations? And this is what led the idea of the events of Shays Rebellion and the difficulties in putting down that rebellion really are what led them to go back to Philadelphia to take a closer look at the articles and see if they could fix it. Now, it's important to note that they went in to this Constitutional Convention in Philadelphia with the idea they were going to fix the Articles of Confederation. They weren't going to start over, but the problem was they saw how many issues and weaknesses they had with the Articles of Confederation. All of the power was in the state governments. There was no central government. There was no strength in that government, and it basically deferred to the states. Well, what happens when the states have a problem with the central government and everybody else, all of the other states, are in line with the central government, but one state decides it's going to revolt? What are you going to do? The central government has no power at that point. And this is where it led them to believe maybe we should start over. Maybe what we're going to have to do is take the good ideas out of the Articles of Confederation and start from scratch. And that's exactly what ended up happening. So in those compromises that we see from the Constitution today, we see a number of things that the framers took, that things that they liked, things that they didn't, they threw out, and we saw some compromises in terms of the Virginia plan, the idea that we're going to count all of the individuals that are in those states, and we're going to have the House of Representatives that is basically made up of representatives based on population. And that would be the Virginia plan. But we're also going to take the New Jersey plan, a smaller state that is probably a little more insecure because they don't have a lot of people. They're never going to be as well represented in the House of Representatives like Virginia would be, a much larger state with a lot more people. And so as a result, the New Jersey plan said, hey, let's have each state be equal. Well, let's set up the Senate, the upper chamber, modeled after the House of Lords in Britain, and let's have them elected by state legislatures, not by the people, to 6-year terms, and we'll take that from the New Jersey plan. So the Connecticut Compromise, the idea of the Great Compromise, was to take both of those plans and then add the 3/5 Compromise, which was the idea that which was a win for northern states in addition to southern states, because northern states didn't want slaves to count as a full vote. It would give more representation to the South. It was the last thing that they wanted, so that's why the 3/5 Compromise ended up being a win-win for both North and South. Southern states got more representation in the House of Representatives. Northern states were able to keep them from getting full representation by a full slave equaled a full head count. And as a result, the idea there is that the House of Representatives would then be population-based, the Senate would be equally based representation, and the compromise was complete. So we see here that the Great Compromise, the Senate is going to be equal. You're going to have 6-year terms. The House, up every 2 years, going to be the people's house, closest to the people as a result of that. You're going to see direct election of the president by the people, but it's really going to be through the Electoral College that people are going to elect the president. It's going to be state legislatures that are going to vote for electors, and those electors will then elect the president. Today, we vote for those electors, and the electors go to the Electoral College in December and elect the President of the United States. So some ideas that were taken from these compromises, but led to not a direct election of the president at all, but Electoral College election of the president. We see him elected to a 4-year term as opposed to some of these other options that were out there. A 4-year term, at this time unlimited re-election. Now George Washington would set the precedent of having served 2 terms and leaving it at that, and then it isn't until the 22nd Amendment, after FDR was elected to 4 terms, 4-4-year terms, that the 22nd Amendment was applied, basically saying that you could only serve 2 full 4-year terms, or a maximum total of 10 years in office, if you assume the office before the previous president has finished. And then the Supreme Court, the judiciary, the judicial branch, those that interpret the laws, would be chosen by the president and appointed and confirmed by the Senate in their role of advice and consent. So as a result of that, the Supreme Court justices are going to be insulated from popular opinion and the public, because the president's going to choose them. And the president being elected by the Electoral College, not by the people, also being chosen by a small few. Think oligarchy, I guess, if you wanted to go back to those types of democracy there, and then confirmed by the Senate. The Senate would have to confirm them. They also not being elected at that time by the people of their state, but by their state legislatures. So a little different there in terms of in terms of the compromises we ended up with. Why do we have compromise? But as we talked about at the beginning, the idea here is in order to get representative democracy, you're going to have to compromise in one way, shape, or form. So some of the compromises here limited the will of popular majorities. We see the Senate, in that case, elected by state legislatures, the president by the Electoral College, the judiciary, the judicial branch, by the president and confirmed by the Senate. And it would make it much more difficult to pass legislation, but that was by design. There's a reason why Congress can't very easily pass legislation, can't repeal Obamacare as quickly as they may like. There's a reason why there are checks and balances in place to limit the power of government, because Madison and the founders, when they sat down to design this, they really didn't want it to be easy. They didn't want it to be just the passions of the people or the whims of the masses. They wanted it to be difficult. They wanted it to be more challenging in nature, so that the true legislation that was the will of the people, that had been cautiously and deliberatively discussed and debated, would then be passed and would then see the light of day. and be something that the people could rally around. And so we see a lot of the concepts from these key principles from this chapter, and what we're going to talk about in subsequent chapters, really coming from this idea. Federalism, the sharing of power, is designed to limit the power, so not one branch or not one level of government has all of the power. And separation of powers supports this. Checks and balances supports this. Rule of law, no one is above the law, also supports this. And the ideas of limited government. So, what was one of the biggest problems that Madison had in terms of trying to throw out the Articles of Confederation and write the Constitution? It was really about how much power do we give the government and in order to maintain that order. How do we balance that idea of power? How do we create a government with enough power to maintain order, but not so much it violates people's rights? And this would be a continuing conversation between Madison and even Patrick Henry and George Mason and others that were anti-federalists because they wanted a Bill of Rights. They were so concerned it was going to be problematic for them. And so John Jay, James Madison, Alexander Hamilton would write the Federalist Papers, Madison being the one that we hear so much about because he was elected president. Hamilton, obviously making a lot of news with the Broadway show up in New York City on Hamilton and in Washington at the Kennedy Center. But the idea behind this is they were really struggling. How do we give government enough power to keep a Shays Rebellion in check, but yet keep it from violating people's rights? And that was one of the biggest concerns that they had. They didn't want it to be too strong. They didn't want Congress to be so powerful that it would get in the way of people's life, liberty, and property. They wanted, they had a lot of concerns, and George Mason was really concerned about this. Patrick Henry's speech about his rally around not supporting the Constitution was really about that central government being too strong. He really was concerned that without a Bill of Rights, we couldn't pass this. This really wasn't going to happen. They were worried about taxes, but they were worried more about central government's power over the people, that we'd have another King George all over again. And that was one of their biggest concerns in addressing this. And without that Bill of Rights, they were concerned that those would not be inherent in protecting the people as a result. So, what rights are protected in that before we added the Bill of Rights? We have writ of habeas corpus. I have to know what I'm being charged with before I can be thrown in prison and then be charged with a crime. Bill of attainder. The idea that you would charge a group of people or a small group of a crime without having their day in court and it being individually charged with a crime, a small group of people being charged with something, or everybody who wore blue today is being thrown in prison. No bills of attainder, no ex post facto laws. If something happened yesterday and now you're passing a law saying you can't do it, you can't go back. Okay, you can't go back. The trial by jury in criminal cases was something that was protected, as well as that no religious test. We see that in the articles, not even in the articles. And then privileges and immunities in terms of states honoring licenses and other types of contracts that are in place, all of that being protected in the text of the Constitution. But these weren't the things that Patrick Henry and George Mason were worried about. They were worried about things like religion. They were worried about things like the right to a speedy trial and a jury of our peers, and the idea of being charged with having to quarter soldiers in your home, which we don't think about today, but was a big issue back then when British soldiers were housed in people's homes. So all of these things really address why Brutus #1 and why Patrick Henry and George Mason were so adamant that a Bill of Rights be added. And it was only when they said, well, if we can't get a Bill of Rights, maybe we should go back and start over and call another constitutional convention. And that was something that alarm bells went off in James Madison's head when they started talking about that, because the concern was, just like the Articles of Confederation, they were going to throw out the entire Constitution, and that he did not want to happen all over again. And so, as a result, he ended up coming on board with the Bill of Rights and got other states, like Virginia, to come along with it. And that ultimately would be where they ended up allowing ratification of the Constitution and including fighting for a Bill of Rights as part of the deal. That's it for Chapter 1. Hope you found this helpful in these top 12 highlights. Go back and look at pieces or key pieces if you need to, but you should be all set for the quiz and or the test on this chapter, and have a great day.